Next slide, please. Great. So let me just start off by introducing our featured speakers here. We'll be joined today by Rajiv Malagi, the manager at Urban Development and Accessibility team at WRI India, and Priya Narayanan, also a manager at Urban Forestry and Urban Development team at WRI India. And myself, I'm a research analyst with the Gender and Social Equity team at WRI in the Global Office. We will begin with a quick introduction to the Cities for Forests program by Priya. Next, I will walk you through two of our online learning resources called Learning Guides that explore urban forest policy and planning, as well as social equity considerations for nature-based solutions. We will then hear from Rajiv and Priya on their recent projects in Kochi that bring the principles of these learning guides to life in creating a safe and resilient public spaces for the present and future in the city. I do want to mention that there will be time at the end to raise questions, and we will try our best to get to them. You are encouraged to also type your questions in the comment and the question and answer box throughout the presentation. Okay, next slide, please. So let me hand it over to Priya to walk us through the Cities for Forests program. Thanks, Priya.
Thank you, Aishi. So welcome everybody. So I will introduce you to Cities for Forests. So Cities for Forests is a citizen and a city-led initiative to add more trees in general to the existing surroundings. The next slide, please. So essentially, the Cities for Forests works at 3 different scales. So inner, nearby, and faraway forest, and they all contribute immensely in building to the different infrastructure there around. For example, the inner forest, it helps provide clean air, shade, and also reduces noise pollution, and also really creates a very livable space for the urban environment around. And the nearby forest provides clean air, drinking water, reduced flooding, and it provides a lot of the watersheds around the urban forests around provide a lot of other factors that contribute to a more livable space, and also they help mitigating the larger climate action. Similarly, the firefly forest also contributes to the overall biodiversity of the place, and they also help mitigate the larger climate action. The next slide, please. So the Cities for Forests focus mainly on political action and engagement with the city. They provide technical assistance, and also they focus on understanding the economics and finance behind the investment at the different levels. The next slide. So across the globe, we are in 65 cities now, and in India, we are in Kochi and Hyderabad. The next slide. Thanks, everybody. So Ayushi can take over the...
Thank you, Priya. Thank you for that brief and crisp introduction to Cities for Forests. I will now briefly walk you through our 2 new resources that we're launching through Cities for Forests. Just to give you a brief background about what these resources are, we're calling them Learning Guides. Now, Learning Guides are our online version of coursework or very basic coursework that have been developed for the City Fix Learn website, which is where they live right now. Now, these learning guides are self-paced courses made up of about 25 to 30 slides that present information at the beginner level, and subsequent courses increase with intensity. These learning guides are intended to be descriptive and not prescriptive in nature. The 2 learning guides that we will be talking about today are intended to be foundational level courses, and we will be building on them subsequently with other themes in the coming learning guides. These 2 learning guides are currently up as drafts on the cityfixlearn.org website, and we are seeking public review and comment on them. We hope you will find a time to take a look at these resources and share them with your network and provide us with your feedback. Next slide, please. So Now that we've walked through what a learning guide is, let me jump right into our two new Cities for Forests learning guides. The first one is titled Urban Forests for Healthier Cities, Policy, Planning, Regulations, and Institutional Arrangements. This learning guide explores the traditional urban policy and planning tools used in cities around the world that can help them manage, protect, and expand their urban forestry. It briefly introduces the user to financing mechanisms and possible institutional arrangements for urban forest governance. The purpose of this learning guide is to build definitions, recognize the importance of urban forests, understand the breadth of stakeholders and institutional arrangements, as well as considering strategies for strengthening, aligning, and integrating more comprehensive urban forest-focused policies, plans, and regulations. The hope with this learning guide is to inspire cities and to manage their forests more holistically so that they can do more with less, which is even more important as COVID erodes the already limited resources in the cities. Next slide, please. The second learning guide is titled Social Equity Considerations for Cities' Decision-Making Related to Inner, Nearby, and Faraway Forests. Just as Priya described, these are the three levels of forests that we describe within the Cities for Forests framework. And this is the learning guide that I will be walking you through today in the next 7 to 8 minutes. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yes. So this learning guide on social equity serves as a reference point for cities to increase their knowledge about social equity considerations as they relate to urban forest design for programs as well as policies. Now, for cities that have already integrated or are working on some or all of these relevant social equity and gender considerations, these learning guides may serve as a checklist or a reminder for them to keep tracking those social equity goals and meet them successfully. Now, who is this learning guide meant for? It is meant for city and community level decision makers, which includes leaders, urban planners, government officials, as well as civil society and other stakeholders that are and should be involved in the planning, implementation, and management of public spaces and urban forests. We want more technical people to look at this learning guide on social equity so that these social equity and gender considerations are well integrated and mainstreamed into all programming and not just siloed or sidelined into their own special gender or social projects. Both the learning guides are, like I said, currently available on the cityfixlearn.org, and you can also download them as PDFs. Next slide, please. Now, the social equity learning guide is divided into 4 main sections. The first one focuses on key social equity concepts and definitions, followed by sections on different social equity considerations for decision makers. These include case studies from all around the world and different resources linked to each topic. The last section is a collection of all of these resources relevant to the topics discussed in the learning guide. Next slide, please. So in the first section, where we define the social equity concepts and backgrounds, we mentioned that the learning guide, our focus is on equity. That is the processes that provide different support to different individuals based on their needs to reach a fair outcome. Equitable and just processes need to be applied and put in place to achieve equality, which is the state of all groups being equal in rights, status, and advantages. We acknowledge that social equity issues vary depending on social, economic, and political context of cities, of countries, and approaches to address these issues should be therefore flexible and managed by the city's decision makers accordingly. Next slide, please. Now, one of the key things that came up during our background research for developing these learning guides, and as we were talking to city officials, was to highlight the benefits of having this gender and social equity lens to design urban plans and policies. Actively integrating social considerations in projects and plans can ensure that we mitigate any potential harms to vulnerable communities, identify their unique needs, and address them through participatory approaches. There are also many social, economic, and environmental benefits for cities when they adopt a social equity lens to all of their programming. And that varies from learning from traditional knowledge and practices from different stakeholders to having a reduced risk of conflicts and achieving their project results successfully. Next slide, please. So this was the background section, section 1 of the learning guide. The next section is what is the meat of this social equity learning guide. We present some social equity considerations that are important for decision makers to keep in mind throughout the project or policy cycle. These are the ones that are in the white box that you see as overarching considerations. So these are more general considerations such as designing equitable policies, using social information and disaggregated data sets, having meaningful stakeholder consultation to design your projects and plans, and providing equal employment opportunities. We then get into some specific considerations relevant to each level of the forests as defined by Cities for Forests. So for example, for the inner forest section, we have social equity considerations related to land use and the spatial distribution of nature-based solutions, and what is the accessibility, safety, and affordability of these solutions. For nearby forests, we have social equity considerations related to watershed resource distribution and ecotourism and recreation services. We then, for clarity, have a slide dedicated to establishing the connection between faraway forests and cities, just like what Priya described in the beginning. And then the learning guide goes on to describe some of the social equity considerations related to faraway forests that city level decision makers should care about. And that includes how city level decision makers can practice equitable procurement of forest-based products. Now let me walk you through some examples of what we cover in these learning guides as it pertains to today's topic, which is public spaces. Thank you. Next slide. So within the learning guide, we have one slide that talks exclusively about spatial equity of nature-based solutions within a city. On this topic, we present research on how neighborhoods or localities with higher incomes, education levels, home ownership, and majority ethnic population may have higher proportions of tree canopy cover, and what that means for the social equity conditions within a city. We also highlight the importance of considering not only just the mere physical distribution of trees across neighborhoods, but also considering the access to a bundle of rights and the resources for the maintenance of these trees and other nature-based solutions. So we also provide multiple case studies throughout the learning guide, both from the global north as well as the global south. So in the learning guide for this topic, you can see we provide a case study from Philadelphia, US. The map on the left shows that green spaces are not equally distributed within the city. And the map on the right shows that the neighborhoods with sparse distribution of greenery are actually the ones that are predominantly low income areas. And so how that affects the social equity makeup of the city and what the correlation is there is important for decision makers to understand. Next slide, please. In our learning guide, we also talk about accessibility and safety considerations of public spaces. Studies have shown that the type, density, and maintenance of trees and vegetation affect perceived personal safety, which includes a fear of crime and violence, which varies, of course, by context and by gender, age, and socioeconomic status of the population where these trees and vegetation are located. And so it is important that we gather information from various stakeholders or conduct safety audits to respond to their specific needs, to make sure that public space design as well as nature-based solution, so, they are designed to meet the needs of different populations and to make sure that they are perceived to be safe and accessible by different user groups. And so this includes gathering information from various stakeholders on their needs, such as lights, benches, ramps, and the removal of dense shrubs. Thank you. Next slide, please. Can you please click on the slide? This is actually a video. Yes, thank you. So this is just an example to show you what it actually looks like on the learning guide. We start with some text describing the topic. We then move into a gallery of case studies, like you can see from the global north and south. And then we move into a section on resources for each of the topics in the learning guide, where we provide tools and latest research and frameworks that city level decision makers or users for the learning guide can access on learning more about these topics, as well as to see what they can do about it. Next slide, please. And the last section of the learning guide is actually a collection of all of these resources. It's the resource section. Now, like I said, each slide within the learning guide has its own set of relevant resources linked onto them, but in the end, we provide this long list of resources for the learning guide's users, easy access. And now these resources range from latest research to toolkits, guidebooks, methodologies on conducting social analysis, participatory planning, stakeholder engagement, some social data sets that city planners can use in their work. And so a lot of work has been done on all of these topics by other wonderful organizations. And we use this space to bring all of it together so that our users can go through them and use them. Next slide, please. And so that was the quick walkthrough of the Social Equity Learning Guide. I would like to now thank the co-authors of this learning guide, that is Edith Junu, John Rob Poole, Natalie Elwell, Paige Langer, Sabin Ray, Tara Verselius. I would also like to thank the whole Cities for Forests team and the partner cities who extended their support for this learning guide and helped shape it into what it is today. Again, like I mentioned, it is live on the CityFix Learn website and it has a feedback button. We would really appreciate it if you took some time to take a look at this. And as you do walk through it, please send us your suggestions and feedback on it. And of course, feel free to contact me with feedback, or if you have any case studies from your work that we can add to our learning guide. Thank you. Over to you, Rajiv.
Hey, hi. Thanks, Ayushi. Thanks. And that was a nice presentation. With that, we'll sort of shift to the next section. We sort of understand this more as an extract of what Ayushi just explained as an overarching framework about the intent of cities for forests and the components within the learning guides. So we will be sort of talking specifically about a case of Kochi. This is a city in the southern part of India, and this will be presented by me as well as my colleague Priya as the second part of it. So just to run through the overall structure of the presentation, we are firstly looking at the idea of public spaces of the city, more through the lens of how they existed in the past and how they have been shaped for the present, and in what way they could be shaped for the future. And then talking a little bit about Kochi and what comprises of this city, and specifically looking this through the lens of green and the green covers, and finally looking at the approach to the public spaces in the city. To start with, my first slide, where if you look at the public spaces of the past and present, I'll sort of address it specifically to the context of India, but this is definitely applicable to a lot of cities around the world. This is one open ground in a city called Delhi in the northern part of country, where on a regular day it is used as a playground, but at the same time it is used as exhibition grounds. And this particular image you see is used during the festivity of a specific festival called the Ram Navami. So the idea of playground itself taking these kind of different roles by different people of and different backgrounds. And at the same time, while these public spaces exhibited different kinds of characteristics and versatility, at present, when we take something like COVID as a situation which has come in, a lot of these public spaces or other open spaces of the city have started to get redefined into something much more than just a recreation, and to shift from recreation to more need-based entities. An example like this one, where a lot of open grounds in India were converted into emergency medical centers, or it could be medical camps or temporary stay or shelter for people. So the role of public spaces and open spaces have started to change over time. And with these kind of understanding and going forward, there is a sort of need to relook at the definition of public spaces in the city. One being multifunctional in nature, where it needs to have that added quality of or added strength of resilience and the safety measure, which should be adopted as a part of these spaces. Secondly, can these spaces cater to emergency situations like the pandemic, which has just happened now, and the kind of elements we put in, be it at a public space or open space scale or at the city level planning. How do we start considering the first two elements which I talked about? And as much as we talk about the spatial planning, what is also important is a kind of an inclusive approach, where there needs to be a dialogue established between the government and the stakeholders on ground. There was an interesting case in India during pandemics where the government, while it was serving a large mass in the city, but at the same time it started falling short of resources, as simple as, let's say, buses for transferring patients or the medical officers from one part of the city to other. And that's where other kind of help kicked in, like the local school buses were used to sort of transfer these patients. So similarly, a lot of locals on ground also took initiatives during COVID to sort of make things function in the right way possible. So can there be a way to sort of formalize these kind of process and also adopt that as a part of public space and an open space design? And the third element being where this is where expert organizations and WRI being one of them sort of starts coming to picture, where the major role we have been playing across different cities is to sort of bridge the gap between the government and stakeholders, to act as neutral agents to see what both of them need and what best could be done for the city. And narrowing down to Kochi specifically, Kochi is essentially in the southern part of the country, like I said earlier, and it is a hub of Eurasian culture, which is basically a mix of European and Asian culture. And you see a lot of diverse population over there. And tourism is one of the very important mode of economy over there. And there are a lot of the city could be accessed by different kinds of modes, including public transport as well as a private transport. And then public spaces like the open grounds, which are the maidans, beach and park, act as important recreational spots. This is both for the locals as well as the tourists who sort of come in. But if you closely look at the aspect of open spaces in the city, the city has all the open spaces concentrated only in the central business district, which comes down to as less as 1% of the gross area of the overall city. And 0.4% of the net area, it is covered by parks and open spaces. But the actual norms of open spaces as per the UDPFI guidelines says that it has to be 10 to 15%. So you can see the kind of difference which exists in the city and how much of this kind of open space the city lacks. This image also you see is a small stretch of a beach to the northern part of Fort Kochi. And during the high tide, even this beach tends to sort of get covered by the seawater. And this is not only happening just because of the natural process of the tides, but also because this is sort of a creek which comes from the mainland. So because of the alterations done, especially in terms of increasing the depth of the sea, because of the bigger commercial ships to come in, that has also changed the course of the tide, which is leading to impacting these kind of open spaces which exist in the city. The other part being the 20%, 21% of the gross area covered by water here. But this is one example of the canal, these canals which are leading to the sea. And most of the canals are in these kind of dilapidated conditions where they end up becoming the backyard for a lot of houses, which in turn converts them into drain. While in the past, these canals were actually used for the internal, transport within the city. So the city is again facing threats to these towards these kind of open spaces as well. And talking about WRI very quickly in terms of our engagement with the city, it started somewhere in 2015, and we have been engaging with different officials starting from the Kochi Metro. And then that led us to doing Ragiri, which is basically an open streets concept to reclaim streets. And in 2018, there was a safe access audit around the metro. And finally, since post 2018, we started to engage with the mayor of the city across both mobility and public space projects. And 2019 and 20 has been a year for two important projects. One is the TUMI project, which is a transformative urban mobility initiative, where we're looking at the aspect of sustainable mobility here. And the second part being the Cities for Forest initiative. And as a part of Cities for Forest, to talk specifically, we did a mapathon of coastal public space challenge, which is currently running. We are going to shortlist a few participants who are going to address the challenge for the beach part, which I just showed in the previous slide, and also looking at certain mobility initiatives. Uh, and finally, coming down to the public space design approach, which we have taken for the city, we're trying to look at the idea of public spaces through these three lenses. One is the equity and inclusivity of the project of public spaces, of the users of the public spaces. Then we are talking about integration of these public spaces with mobility. And finally, looking at the building resilience component to it. The first one, where we are talking about the equity, this is one tactical urbanism project which we did in the Fort Kochi area, and the intent was to sort of revitalize the historic public square, which is essentially an important landmark in the city. And if you can see, this is the current status of the public space, where it is used either for dumping or haphazard parking, and this is right next to the beach. So it ends up becoming either a parking spot or a vending spot, while this space actually has a significance to be of a high historic value. What we essentially did was, we started with the whole process of talking to some of the key users of the space, starting from the mayor and the ex-mayor, who was the important decision maker of the city. And then we had assisting agencies, local councillor, the city police commissioner. And then it was not just about decision making, but also involving the right kind of communities and people of all background and age groups. So which led us to talk to the fishermen community, the homestay associations, and a couple of other NGOs who are working on ground towards reviving the open spaces in the city. And that led us to creating this public led event, where this was not just done by the WRI team or a consultant, but it was actually revitalized and redesigned by the users of the neighborhood itself. So people of the neighborhood came in, they helped clean up the space, they helped create these kind of installations, and they also celebrated the space at a given point of time. So the opportunity like that led us to go forward with the next project, which we are currently working on, which is the TUMI project, where we are looking at integrating mobility and public spaces together, and looking at streets itself as means of linear open spaces of the city. And we are looking at different interventions, right from improving junctions to tactical urbanism, to even developing a wayfinding project which can help both the locals and tourists to access different places. Another important part of the TUMI project, which evolved because of the current need of the pandemic, was to look at integration of open spaces with the mobility of the city. While mobility was spread throughout, we looked at focusing, concentrating these different modes of mobility together at the same time, linking them to important public spaces of the city, with the primary intent of connecting these bigger open spaces which were used as emergency spaces of the city. And this to me COVID document is again up online. If anybody wants to refer to, I'll be happy to share the link for that. And then we zoom down to these kind of scales, where we're looking at creating safety in public spaces and bringing in the aspect of social distancing as a part of public spaces. And with this, I'll hand over to Priya, my colleague Priya. And Priya, if you can just go ahead with this.
Thank you, Rajiv. We'll transcend into cities for forest again. So cities for forest essentially is to build a resilience in cities through green infrastructure. So that is how we are going forward from here, and it involves it is a city-led movement, and also it involves a lot of participatory approach where we work with a lot of institutions on ground to enhance green tree cover. So the next slide, please. So the main aim of Cities for Forests is to take the city from the current situation to a more resilient, well-endowed and green city. So in the Cities for Forests, the larger ambit, we hope to develop for the city of Kochi a guidance document which will enable Kochi city to have long-term visions for greening the city, and also to provide some short-term strategies for interventions at different scales. So our main focus will be to bring about tree plantation at the local level, and to understand what are the existing vulnerabilities and the community resilience to it, and also to develop a small action plan specific to heat. The next slide, please. So we are working essentially at two levels. At the city level, we are trying to understand the spatial vulnerability, and at the neighborhood level, we are trying to understand what are the different interventions that we can do with regard to trees at different levels, different typologies, for example, avenue planting or block planting, and also to understand how the disaster risk at the neighborhood level is. So how different, because vulnerability is very heterogeneous across the city. So trying to capture how these differential vulnerabilities can be entwined into the local disaster preparedness. The next slide, please. So one of our major action towards that was we had a Macathon activity, as Rajiv mentioned earlier this year. This was a participatory approach where we involved the local councillors and citizens to understand what would be the potential greening areas in Kochi. So apart from what is existing, and the existing green spaces is very limited, and but there is still large scope for improvement. So we try to understand this, and the on-ground implementation of these green interventions will happen towards the middle of next year. The next slide. So essentially, the main agenda is to see where there's potential of green, and where the lack of green actually is leading to these heat island effects. So if we can overlay our interventions in these areas and provide these long-term preparedness to heat. So this is the main kind of action on ground that we foresee from the cities forests. The next slide. So again, these are some clips from the Mapathon activities. Next slide, please. So our tree-based interventions are specific to a particular deep dive region. So like I mentioned earlier, we try to understand the different typologies of interventions that we can do on ground. So this is one particular region in the eastern part of Kochi. So where there is a potential for improving close to 20 to 30 hectares of green spaces, or improving potential, tree cover in these in these open spaces. So there is large potential. So this we identified with our Mapathon activity. The next slide. And jumping now into how all this is tied up with the resilience, the move which we want to in Kochi to happen, where the city is now doing firefighting with regards to disaster preparedness, but we wanted to be more inclusive and be more resilient in future. So we have an in-house tool called the UKRA. So that helps to assess the different individual and community capacities, and also helps to understand about how different communities behave when there is a risk, what are the strengths existing between the communities. Next slide, please. And how they adapt when a particular risk condition comes. So these are some of the indicators that are available in the UKRA framework. So we individually assess each of these indicators at different scales, at the city, neighborhood, and household scale, and try to understand how climate risk is perceived at the household level, how climate risk is tackled at the city, at the policy level, and how each neighborhood has this collective preparedness, because risk is not really something that's happening now, and it's been happening for the last many years, but how it has been tackling the different climate risks over the last many years. Next slide, please. So our approach in Kochi is essentially multi-stakeholder engagement, and then doing the spatial vulnerability hazard map. So the on-ground support that I was talking about earlier is from actually trainings that we would impart to the Kudumbashree, and also in turn get knowledge from them about the community, and try to understand what the community's perception is through these frontline helpers and workers. So that is the idea, that we try to understand at the individual level what is how different people cope with the different situation, and how we can assess the different vulnerabilities. The next slide, please. So overall in Kochi at the moment, we have done different interventions. So one is the tree-based interventions, and one is improving of public space, like the public space challenge, which Rajiv was talking about, is essentially in a small stretch in the Mahatma Gandhi beach in Fort Kochi. We would be implementing the area so that it becomes more accessible and utilizable for the public, and also understanding understanding neighborhood and individual resilience capacities. So all this ties up in a way that having a nature-based or tree-based intervention at the local level and improve public space and a more resilient, livable city. So all this ties back to having a better open public space, better city, and also a better environment in and around Kochi. So these are the different scales of interventions at the neighborhood, city, and individual interventions that we are doing through Cities for Forests. And as Rajiv mentioned, this would also have some overlap between TUMI, the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative, in specific areas in Kochi. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, both Rajiv and Priya, for that great presentation about your work in Kochi. I think it really tied together some of the concepts that we were talking about as part of the learning guide, and helped greatly show us what it means to work on these nature-based solutions and public spaces. We are now open for questions, so um, please. I don't know, Leo, if you can see if people are raising their hands. Um,
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to raise their hands, feel free, and I can just allow you to unmute. I mean, yeah. There's
okay, so
already a question. Yeah.
sorry, go ahead. I was just going to read the question on the Q&A box right now, which is, I think, for Rajiv and Priya. What were the political, institutional, governance challenges that you faced in this project? So I'll let you answer that while other people raise their hands or populate this section with other questions.
Sure. Thanks, Aishi. Priya, you want to take that or I can go ahead?
Go ahead, Rajiv. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is sort of a fundamental question which generally tends to exist in most of the projects because there is a lot of political and institutional dynamics which does happen, starting from a very simple fact that when you have the key representatives of the area or the city, and they tend to get transferred at a given point of time because of various reasons. So the idea is, while you have established a certain relationship with them and the associated people, and while these kind of shifts happen, you need to sort of reestablish these kind of connections. But I think what has really worked in terms of our favor is like the slide had shown earlier, where because we act as neutral agents to sort of engage both with the city governments as the people and as well as the people on ground. We tend to identify a few key champions of the project, be it, uh, although they have a authority to sort of take certain decisions, or rather have a possibility to sort of influence someone else to take decisions. So usually by identifying these key champions of the project, that really helps us to steer the project in the right direction for a relatively longer time. And the second part being is the idea of equity come into picture, where it because let's say, for an example, like the tactical urbanism project on ground required for us to talk to the users of the space and understand what their needs are, but at the same time, as simple as sort of removing those 200 to 300 two-wheeler parking and just shifting them like 60 meters away from the public space on the periphery, and to sort of convince them to say that it's not going to do any harm to you by just by letting you walk for that 60 meters, was a bigger challenge earlier. But while we convinced one set of people, and that led these people to sort of convince the rest of the crowd over there. So there are these dynamics which also happen on ground, and they may or may not be political or institutional, but of course, yes, we have sort of faced as well as tackled these kind of issues. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Rajiv. Um, Let me take the couple of questions that were about the learning guide. So there's one on if the learning guide can be used without the assistance of WRI. Yes, this is an online slide deck. So, and it contains a lot of rich resources from various sources and the work that already exists and is published out there. So definitely, please go through it and share it with your networks. I do want to say that we are working with the cities that are a part of Cities for Forests, and there are, I think, more than 75 cities all around the world, to help them pilot some of the research that we have mentioned in the learning guides, or to help them strengthen their processes, and to make sure that the social equity considerations that we talk about within the learning guide are being followed in their projects and plans. And so that work will begin next year, but that is our sort of grounding some of the concepts that we mentioned in the learning guide and how we are going to take it forward as Cities for Forests. But yes, feel free to use it and share it more widely within your networks. There were a couple of other questions asking if it is specific to certain types of cities or certain geographical areas. No, we have kept the learning guide, both the learning guides actually, very broad. And like I mentioned, they're very foundational courses. They don't really have the space to get into details and context. And in various places, we have mentioned that all users and decision makers who use this learning guide as a reference should take into consideration their own social, political, legal, economic contexts or geographies that are happening in their cities or their localities to put the concepts of the learning guides into practice. We do draw from a wide range of case studies from cities all over the world. And so hopefully that brings in that diverse perspective, and multiple case studies, multiple success stories or learning stories can help you realize what social, economic, political landscapes and the differences therein can mean to put these learning guide concepts into practice. But in short, it can be used very broadly. So please feel free to look through it. Let me come back to Rajiv and Priya on our next few questions. We have a question on, have you considered Miyawaki forests, and are you also working on this in Mumbai?
Yeah, so Miyawaki, of course, it's interrelated when you say the next question. Mumbai City Corporation is one of the largest kind of, I would say, promoters of Miyawaki forest right now in India. But under the Cities for Forest platform, we do provide a bundle of opportunities which incorporates more landscape approach, and within the city, depending on whatever degree of space is available, Miyawaki is definitely considered, but we're looking into the other actions that can be taken on ground, and really focus on how the community and the city wants to incorporate some of the other opportunities like avenue or community gardens or home gardens or block plantations. So we are exploring different opportunities, but we will be considering Miyawaki as well. And the question of Mumbai, so Cities for Forest essentially is not in Mumbai is not a part of the Cities for Forest platform, but there is a lot of ongoing work, especially on vulnerability assessment and heat assessments in Mumbai. Yeah, and I think there is another question on what is the relationship of Cities for Forests with the city? So, like I said, this is a city-led movement. So the mayor's office is they bolster the activities in the city. So they sign on the platform, and WRI facilitates the activities on ground and helps build partnership and other implementation activities on ground. So we are technical partners, but the mayor office is the main for all cities. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm looking to see if participants just want to jump in and comment or give us their feedback. Please feel free to do that. And just as a plug, if you want to learn more about Cities for Forests and how it works, you can log on to the website. It's www.citiesforforests.org. Priya, over to you again to clarify the relationship between WRI and Cities for Forests.
Right. So again, so Cities for Forests is a global initiative, and WRI is one of the partners. We also have Revolve Media, who supports the Cities for Forests platform, and like I said, the mayor's office across the 65 cities across the globe, they form. They are the they have the agreement to be a part of the Cities for Forest platform. So we facilitate and provide technical support and build capacities across cities.
Thanks, Priya. I also wanted to mention both Revolve and pilot projects have been great partners in founding this Cities for Forests and making it happen. A question from the chat. Are there resources with regards to planting native trees in a certain area? Example, Telangana. I'm not in my learning guide, but I'm going to hand it over to Priya and Rajiv, who know more about nature-based solutions.
There are resources. So the State Forest Department and each State Forest Department and also the State Biodiversity Board have a list of native species and native species and also endangered species list marked. And also if it is specific to a city, we have the City Biodiversity Register. It is across some cities in India, so that have a list of species. So I mean, if I can give an example, so most of the species that are so listed in the Biodiversity Act, so there are close to about 385 to 390 species. So those are some of them are native to India. So the exclusive list each state provides. So all this is can be easily downloaded from the respective State Forest Department or the Biodiversity Board websites.
Thank you for the great questions. We still have a few minutes left, so just in the next 2 minutes, please feel free to jump in or send us some questions. Actually, in the meantime, Priya, if I can ask you to tell us a little bit about what's next for Cities for Forests and the work you're doing in Kochi or other cities in India.
Like with regard to Kochi, I think we are going to support the Kochi Municipal Corporation in with the guidance document that would be supporting their city disaster management plan. So we will provide recommendations from our mapathon, which will enable them to highlight on the different tree-based interventions they can do to mitigate climate change effects. We'd also be separately giving them a heat resilient solution plan that again involves tree-based interventions, and also be giving recommendations from the UKRA tool to understand how community resilience needs to be incorporated in a city planning process. So this is something we will be doing in Kochi and in Hyderabad, the other city in India where work is slowly commencing. We would be doing a tree baseline study again and try to understand how why and how tree inventory should be into the climate, should be a part of the local climate action plan. So we'll be using a global prototype tool, which is actually prototyped in the US now. We'll be implementing it in Hyderabad. So that would incorporate the GHG emissions at the city level. And also we would be seeing what are the other opportunities, because Telangana is already doing massive tree plantation programs. So also trying to see if there can be partnerships built on the other existing activities in Telangana.
Great, thank you. Exciting things ahead. there's a question on if there is active marketing of the guide, and if so, where. Let me actually dig up the link for the learning guide and send it to you. We have it on the Cities for Forests website, but what we encourage you to look at is the City Fix Learn website, because it has the feedback option there. And it would be great to hear from our users who go through the learning guide to tell us their comments and what they liked and didn't like. So I'm just going to, in a second, post that link on the chat here. In the meantime, actually, I'll turn to Rajiv also just one final time. What is next for your work, and what are you looking forward to in the kind of work that you described to me?
Yeah, thanks, Ayushi, for that. Essentially, to me, primarily focus on mobility as a layer, to be precise, a sustainable mobility option. But what is interesting, which is happening right now, is this whole aspect of wayfinding signage, which is coming in, where while we are mapping and sort of representing the fundamental layers for a tourist or a local to sort of reach to the respective destinations or the daily facilities and amenities, because we are also trying to look at that through the lens of resilience and pandemic situation which is coming in. So we are trying to see if they can be a way to sort of overlap these other resilience layers or emergency points or other needs of the city, which would be of importance for people during these kind of pandemics. That's something which is very prominently coming in the signage, but at the same time, we'll be developing a city level website which will have all these layers. So if someone is coming there, either as a tourist or a local, they'll still be able to personalize this website to see all these layers, including mobility, public spaces, resilience. So which could possibly help them to sort of know about the city and experience the city in a much better way.
Great. Thank you so much, Rajiv. And thank you everyone who's here. I do want to take the last few seconds to thank Leona, who's been providing us support in making this webinar happen. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you also to Tara, who is actually the lead author of the first learning guide that I presented, Urban Policy and Planning, who couldn't make it to the webinar, but really worked hard to make this webinar happen also. And thank you for all our participants who took the time to be here and to chat with us. And like I said, the recording will be presented on our registration page on the website where you might have found the link to register. That's where we'll post the recording. And thank you again for joining. Please feel free to contact us with any questions, comments, feedback. And have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.